Hey guys, George Mesa, Third Eye Edify podcast, and I am so excited to have on the show somebody that I consider a living legend, a true pioneer of not only solo bass guitar, but the ideas of tuning and all kinds of other things. And we always discuss things like frequencies on this show, and this person is a master of the concept, and I am so honored to have him here. I just messaged him on a whim, and he said yes right away. And Michale Manring, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. And please let everyone know a little bit about yourself, the amazing sprawling career you've had with other people and so many different genres, and your own pursuit of this solo bass guitar situation as well.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure, and I appreciate your interest in hearing what I have to say about these various topics. So yeah, I fell in love with the bass guitar when I was 9 years old. I just really had a passion for it. Music was always kind of a big part of my life. We had a piano in the house from before I was born that I used to goof around on all the time. But when I heard the bass, that was it for me. That really resonated and was kind of allowed me to kind of take my musical interests to another level. And I did pretty well in school, but at the time, it was time to decide where to go to college. I just couldn't think of anything else that I wanted to do other than be a musician. I actually think of myself sort of as a composer first and a bass player second, but I don't really make that much of a distinction between those two things. They're both really, really important to me. And in fact, what I enjoy most is composing for the bass. And we can talk about that if you like. It's there's a lot. I have a lot of ideas around that and how that's so. And I went off to music school for a year. And in those days, they told you to leave as soon as you could. It's hard to believe.
Right.
But they said, the administration didn't say this, but the teachers said, you need to get out there and start gigging as soon as you can. And I got a gig at the end of the first year and went off to be a professional musician. And that's all I've ever done since. I've tried to go back to school a couple times because there's more I wanted to learn, but most of what I've learned since then has been through private instruction or just doing a lot of reading my own and combination of those things. And yeah, I've been a professional composer and bassist all these years. And there were some pretty lean years in there, and still occasionally there are lean years. But I've somehow managed to make it work. And I suppose I should be thinking about retirement. And while there might be good to turn down some of the gigs, all I can think of is how much more music I want to make.
It's a treacherous thing to call yourself a composer nowadays, unless you get a gig with, let's say, like a big Hollywood studio or some kind of stage, plays and things like that. It's a tough thing to only do that, which is a great reason that you've been, laying down bass lines for other people as well. And it's funny that you mentioned the, get out of education quick, go do your thing, because they don't say it a lot, unfortunately. And it's a major factor of being an actual musician. You can hit the books all you want, and once you hit the stage, everything changes. You never know till you do play the show,
Yeah, I really wanted more music school. I have my whole life. But, they were essentially right about that, hanging out for those 4 years and getting a degree, wasn't really, if you wanted to teach in a public school, then yeah, you definitely needed that. But if you kind of wanted to be a musician, a composer, or a player, then, kind of getting out there and making connections and the whole game you got to play is important to do early on. And you're right, being a composer is really kind of an amazing thing to do. In my teenage years, it was an amazing path to go on. We can talk about that if you like. If you decide you're going to be a composer, I thought a lot about what does that mean and how does that fit in with the whole structure of the society and all that kind of stuff. And it's always been fascinating and just keeps being fascinating. And, maybe we're even kind of at the end of the period when people can call themselves composers. We'll see.
It's tough to quantify sometimes because there's a lot of, in quotes, composing going on, but they're almost guided by the systems that they use. They almost hand feed you the ideas, like, okay, here's the measures are already sitting there, the 16 measures, you fill this in, make this work. Here's a drum beat to play to or write to. A lot of times it's not from scratch, where it's just pencil and paper to begin with.
Yeah, that's not unusual. I mean, that's always been the case to some extent or other. If you compose something completely, wholly new, sometimes it doesn't really make sense. Mm-hmm. So my interest as a composer, I'm not really that interested in being creating something totally original. That's actually pretty easy. We could sit here right now and come up with, dozens of completely original approaches to music that have almost certainly never been done before. You could play the piano with the tomato and only, play in the key of C sharp, Phrygian, and I'm pretty sure nobody's ever done that. But the question more is what you're doing relevant? So for me, it's been more a matter of trying to understand lots of musical systems and try to understand how they work and what they do and how they've been employed at various times and places, and trying to think of how I can use those to, add something hopefully relevant in this time and place.
Well, I think that you have.
Oh, thank you.
I say that with a huge bout of confidence, and thankfully the feedback from what you do is obviously, it's typically astonishment at first. As soon as you flick your first key on the headstock or the bridge, people are like, wait a minute, what is happening? You don't even have to be a musician or a bass player to realize that something pretty unique is going on. And
thank you.
Of course, and I know that you had this bass made for you. You had this in mind initially. Were you in the middle of writing things and said, I really could use several levers to quickly change my tuning without necessarily having to fret a new note as your root of the chord or something like that? Was that where it came from?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I had gotten interested. I was actually always interested from the time I first picked up the bass when I was 9. I was interested in tuning it differently, but I didn't really know much at that point. But as I learned more about music, this idea became more and more appealing, and the more I did with it, the more appealing it became, and the more there seemed to be to work with. And so this idea of, I usually call it dynamic tuning, where you're moving the tunings as you're playing, really became irresistible to me. And I searched for a while to find somebody who could help me with an instrument that was designed for that, because I'm not much of a woodworker or anything like that. But yeah, I was lucky enough to find Joe Zahn out here in California who thought that was an interesting idea to pursue. I talked to a number of builders about these ideas, and I'm sure most of them encouraged me to seek therapy. So.
It's not happening. Can you even put it in writing? I mean, it's an incredible thing. Really, it's incredible. There's several levers on the bridge, and they all activate each other in different ways. And the I guess you have 4 positions on each tuning knob, and each machine head. Is that right?
Yeah, with this one, I can show you a little bit actually. Although maybe I'll describe it. Sure. So as you mentioned, there's retuning systems at both the headstock and the bridge, so both ends of the instrument. At the headstock, there's a little tuning keys that are designed to change the tuning of each string separately, and there are 3 positions for those. So just with the headstock, it's a 4-string bass. Just with the headstock, that's 81 tunings that you get with 3 positions.
Oh my God.
And then the bridge is designed to move sets of strings, and you set it up. All these things you set up to do what you want to do, and they can be changed. Some of the systems I actually change in the middle of a show, so I'll do a piece and then chat for a while I change the tuning system from one set of intervals to another. But the bridge can move all 4 strings at once to a different tuning, or 2 of the strings or 3 of the strings, whatever you like. I generally don't use the bridge to just change one string because I can do that at the headstock.
Oh, I see. That makes sense.
But this is just one way of doing this. There are many other possibilities. These days, I'm able to do this electronically as well. So often I'll combine the two. I have systems that will create a virtual bass, and the virtual bass can be tuned however I like, and I'll combine that with the real bass.
Wow.
And then change those tunings usually with my feet. I'll change those tunings.
Right.
And I can do all those things in combination.
Oh,
so to me, this is really exciting. It's a really thrilling place to go. I'm not aware of anybody else that's really done this kind of thing. There's a few guitar players who've goofed with it a little bit on acoustic guitar, but it's, mostly it's a kind of wide open world to play around in.
Sure.
And I feel bad. I should have done a lot more with it than I have. I mean, there's just so much to do. It's really humbling, I guess is what it is.
Well, you really found your niche with it. And what really is, and like I said, the word astonishment earlier, what really is astounding is that you can tell that it is you doing it. You have your own style within these let's call them parameters. They're actually very freeing, but they are parameters. And you really found something with this, a voice. And that doesn't always happen. You're welcome. That does not always happen.
That's the trick, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the trick, is anytime you have a system, a technology, a tool, the trick is to make sure that you're using that in the service of something else, because the tool itself is awesome, but the real goal is to be able to say something with it that hopefully makes sense. And for me, this I have a whole, I guess it's a musical philosophy is what you would call a musical perspective, maybe a little less grandiose sounding.
Right.
And it's about, how these things allow me to work within that musical perspective.
Right. And of course, your use of harmonics. And if this is going over, a little bit too far over anyone's head, you can see some of my previous music episodes. I actually played and discussed harmonics and how they function at a bass level. That really helps you expand the range. So then again, it sounds like, wait, is this one bass guitar? It's so hard to know if you don't see you doing it. And there's lots of footage available of you doing it, by the way. And because I heard, way back in the day, what was it, Thonk? You were playing with Michael Hedges and some other pretty head dudes.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Right? And I'm like, who was this guy, man? And then maybe it came with an issue of a bass magazine. It wasn't Bass Player magazine, but something from the UK. And there was in the track listing, your song Helios was on there. And I'm half Greek, so those words I'm immediately sticking out to me,
Oh, okay.
Son, right?
Yeah.
And I heard that track and I'm like, this is something special, because it's hard not to say, okay, what's this guy doing that Victor Wooten isn't? When you hear that kind of style. And here it is. Here's something that people are doing that Victor Wooten isn't. It's you really, again, you've took something, you made it your own. You're not trying to overdo it. And it really is you. Your voice is present within this, what harmonics you choose. And, because my ear's tuned to those things, obviously, and how you use them. It's all amazing. And I want to quickly mention this, because we talked about this right before we started here. Reading magazines back especially in the 90s, when magazines were alive and thriving, and not as much as they are now. Unfortunately, they're going by the wayside, a lot of them. You were quoted saying bass lines don't always have to be funky, and it really genuinely stuck with me for my entire bass career, and especially doing covers when you have to kind of mimic somebody else, and I say it to students all the time. I really do.
Oh, okay.
And something else I say to students all the time, which comes right back to you saying, are you a composer? Are you a bassist? Are you a musician? Lots of people own a bunch of instruments. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're like a full-on composing musician, even though I think all human beings are musicians and scientists and everything else. You were already that when you're born. But I cook all the time, and I don't call myself a chef. So I think there's a very important distinction to make when you're learning instruments, when you're getting good at something, when you're trying to become more proficient at mechanics and theory and all this other stuff. There's a humble approach that needs to be there, and you evoke this humble approach big time.
Oh, thank
and
you.
It's appreciated.
That's really nice. Thank you.
The music world's a much better place with you in it, man. And
well, you're
writing,
really kind. I mean, I really just am, following my little path, that I'm passionate about, that I love doing.
And that's why it's working, I think. Just like when I talked to Bakidi on here, and he said there was no plan B, this is what I do.
Right.
That's it. That's really it, And coming around when you were speaking of retirement, I personally stopped full-on gigging, and that's all I did for like 15 years. I stopped full-on gigging. I didn't necessarily choose the exact moment, but I said no for my very first time.
Yeah.
And it all just disappeared.
Yeah.
I brought someone to tears. Like they actually didn't think I said no. I said, no, I can't do it. He's like, okay, I'll see you. Did you just say no? Did you just say no? You've never said no. And and it's just these moments, right?
Right.
So I have one more thing to ask before we actually jump into the topic at hand. Because all of the things, it's great that you just fleshed out the details of your own personal experience here as a musician and a composer and a bass player, primarily bass guitarist, is that this is what my entire point of the entire episode is. We're going to be discussing the advent of AI bass and AI composition and AI music in general. We're going to quickly go over how it's not a new thing, actually. And everything you just discussed is proof enough that we cannot replace you. We cannot replace bass players with this stuff, They work off very simple binary systems at its core. Because before I did my, music schooling, I did computer science. And this one teacher kept saying, there's no magic in this box. It's just zeros and ones. That's it. There isn't even one more thing that it can possibly do. It's just a matter of how fast can it compute those things.
Yeah.
And the soul is not there. And I hope to get into that in a little bit as well, actually. And my final question for you with an incredible tuning setup, and I didn't play any of it here for the audience. I'll certainly have your website in the show notes for people to see what you're all about. But I do suggest looking up any performance from this man. You will see. It's really unbelievable.
Thank you.
You're welcome. What about 440 and equal temperament? You are certainly towing the line there with your instrument. Are you in 440? Or do you tune to 440 before you start rocking?
Yeah. So this is a really interesting issue. There's for people who don't know, there's a standard tuning reference that's been in place since the 30s, really.
Yeah.
That's used pretty much all over the world. The Japanese resisted it until about 10 years ago.
Right.
Where we all tune to the same reference pitch. And that's 440 cycles per second. Now, some people feel that it should be something different, and it has been throughout history. In fact, it wasn't really even standardized very well for a long time. So if you were in one town and went to the next town, the one town everybody may have been tuned to 432, and you went to the next town and everybody's tuned to 443.
Right.
So that's been the case for most of human history. But there are people who don't think that 440 should be used, mostly because they feel it has mathematically inappropriate derivations. It's mostly that it's a multiple of 11,
right?
Things like that. So it's important to say that as far as I'm concerned, music is experiential. So if a truck drives down the street and you have a musical experience from that, then as far as I'm concerned, that's music. Even though the truck driver didn't mean it to be.
Right.
So if you listen to music that has a different tuning reference, a very popular one is 432, for instance, and you're moved by that in a particular way, then that's your musical experience, and that's kind of all that matters, really, as far as I'm concerned. But I should say that the numerology involved with the tuning reference, such as this, doesn't really have good arguments behind it because of this. This tuning reference, 440, refers to cycles per second. So anything that's vibrating at 440 cycles per second produces an A. And so all these tuning references are tied to cycles per second. And the second isn't a naturally occurring phenomenon. It's, almost a random time interval that we picked. So it's not really tied to anything real, these tuning numbers like that. If they were tied to, phases of the moon or the exact length of the year or the frequency of our brain waves, something like that, then that you'd have a better argument. But just because it's tied to cycles per second, it doesn't really, the arguments aren't really there. Again, if you're moved by a different tuning reference, that's all that matters. But if you're looking for a justification other than that, it's a little bit of a stretch. Now that said, there does appear to be an enormous amount of, we can call it numerology, I guess. Numerology in music. But it seems to have to do more with relationships in music. That music is really kind of more about relationships between notes as opposed to the specific frequencies of the notes. And maybe I should demonstrate that. Is that all right?
Yeah, definitely. And this has been discussed on this show in a very similar light. So I'm glad that you said that.
Okay.
I'm really glad you said that.
Can you hear this? Okay. Probably can't hear it. Great.
It's a little quiet. It could be a little louder if you have it.
Yeah, I'll turn it up just a little bit. Okay.
That's beautiful. What's on the top? Is it walnut? What's on the top there? Or is it bubinga?
That's bubinga.
Oh, yeah.
So if I play this, you probably recognize that right away as Somewhere Over the Rainbow. If I did it here, you probably still recognize it as Somewhere Over the Rainbow. If I did it here, or here, or here, all those you recognize as Somewhere Over the Rainbow. It doesn't matter where I play it. And if I go back to where I played it first, which you probably didn't notice there, is that's not where I played it first.
Right.
So it doesn't really matter, where these relationships are. It's the relationships that really matter. And I teach a fair number of non-musicians, and I've always struggled to come up with a good metaphor for how this works. And the best I've come up with is it's a little like sports. If there's a football game, you don't really care as much like where it is, whether it's in Miami or Denver, as that the rules are followed and the teams are there that That's what's really important. And it matters, it matters where it's played, but not as much as these other things. And that's kind of how these numerological systems work in music. So it's all about these relationships. And we seem to be really sensitive to how these relationships work, and in this very bizarrely specific way. And I'd be happy to talk more about that if you like.
Well, this could be an entire episode, this whole thing, right?
It could be.
And I had a very solid chunk of music episodes all in a row. And my main concern at the end of it, because I've been on other shows discussing this too, and a lot of people are gravitating towards the 432. Now, when you look at the pattern created by 440 versus 432, if you look at it on a sound plate, 432 does look nicer than 440. But everything you said is exactly my argument as well. People say, I tuned my guitar to 432. I'm like, great. So now you're playing 6 different frequencies all at once, and it doesn't even have a 432 at that point, if it's not the open string, right? So it's all relationships. It's all depending on what's going on. My concern is equal temperament. I think equal temperament is the genuine issue here, which is one of the best things that you have Planet Fretless doing all this stuff. And, I got a few fretlesses laying around too. And the overtone series shows us that the pitches don't exist in the coordinates, let's just say, of equal temperament. And that's enough for me. Nature has immutable laws, and I feel like equal temperament fights those immutable laws, and it has actually helped things like the Western pop music that is so loved and cared for by so many different people, and it seems to be doing a disservice to us in a lot of different ways. And again, this can be a whole, But what? Okay, well, let's end there. Is equal temperament? Is it a cultural problem? Are people not even in tune with themselves because of this?
Well, this is fascinating, and this has been a passion of mine since I was 16, and discovered these things, and this has been it was a particular interest in composers in the 20th century. A number of them took up this idea, and let's see if we can kind of lay it out for people so they can understand. Let's do it this way. Since I'm playing,
sure, please.
I will do this. I'm going to play these two notes together, and I'm going to play them just as they're tuned on the piano.
Mm-hmm.
Let me get this exactly right. Okay. If you play those two notes on a piano, that's how they're tuned together, and you don't have a choice about that.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to move the higher one down just a little bit. So here's the lower one.
Right.
And now here's where the piano is. And almost everyone will hear this lower one as being more settled, more consonant. You can use whatever words you like to describe it. So this is what's meant by the difference between just intonation and equal temperament. The lower one I played is the relationship between those two notes is exactly 5-2. The higher one I played, the one on the piano, the relationship between those is actually an irrational number.
Right,
it's so complex.
Not to measure it, yeah. Yep.
But it's close. It's close to 5-2. And so it kind of gets the job done, but it's not, it does have a little bit of dissonance in it. It isn't quite pure. And that's true of all the notes on the piano, all the relationships between the notes on the piano, except for the octaves. So all the C's are perfectly in tune with each other, and all the G's are perfectly in tune with each other. But every other note on the piano is, one of these kind of close, but not, not really quite perfect intervals in this way. And so this is an interesting question. What was done on the piano is to kind of realize that, well, let me back up just a second. So if you look at notes in this relational kind of context, you would need a different note for every key you're in.
Right. So
if you played in C, you'd have one set of 12 notes. And then if you played in E flat, you would have all the notes would be slightly different tuning, just like I was playing. It's not a lot. In fact, that's one of the biggest, off just intonation tunings there is in equal temperament.
Right.
And so that was a big problem, especially in Europe, where people were experimenting a lot with music. And, for a very long time, people dealt with this in some really interesting ways. And then people just decided, well, let's just divide the octave evenly into 12 segments. And so everything is just equal distant apart. And that's why it's called equal temperament. And it's close enough, all the notes are close enough, but none of them is quite perfect except for the octaves.
Right.
And that system was actually adopted pretty late. Beethoven even did not write in equal temperament.
Right.
It's kind of astonishing to me that it's very rare to hear his music in the tuning that he used. He used what's called a mean tone tuning. And that would have mattered to him a lot.
Right.
We can talk about that if you like, but that would have been a big deal. And it's kind of strange that, just by default, you always hear his music in equal temperament.
That's a good point. And you hear if there's any transposition or even just tonicization or modulation of any, just transposition, if there's a modulation or a tonicization of any kind, and you're hearing symphonies do these Beethoven pieces, they don't even have the same impact because they're not finding what he had in mind for certain modulations, especially. You can tell that it's not meant for equal temperament. You can really hear it,
Yeah, that's right. And, all the composers before him, nobody used equal temperament. So, all this Mozart,
Right.
Bach especially, Bach had his own tuning system, and it's never been discovered.
I know, and I think that's what I want to know more about this trek to Weimar, this trek to, repairing organs and stuff like we were discussing right before we started recording here. If he tuned your organ, it probably not only sounded, nicely in tune, but maybe perhaps even better than ever. And then it's resonating within a cathedral. So you're getting all the benefits of that. And that's another whole conversation.
Yes,
for sure. Without a doubt, Incredible. And I think that the other factor of all of this is that, a lot of people say, well, whatever, why should I care about this?
Mm-hmm.
But to have some kind of a purity in key, I think is a big deal, because other than the temperament thing, what I really was shooting for more than anything else was that we all have a tonal center as well. And we resonate with we have our own set of 12 notes, or however many notes you want to even mention, in our own personal key. And for you to hear music where F sharp is the same for every key, that really does break, it fights that. And every tonal center should have its own set of pitches that work their way back to the tonic again. Much like when you hear a bagpipe or a sitar, and there's a drone pitch going the whole time, every note is coming back. They keep coming back home. It's cycling like a toroidal field almost. And with equal temperament, we definitely lose that. And we're on the nerd edge of the spectrum here, but it's a really crucial conversation that is not often talked about, unfortunately, and people may not understand the magnitude of it. And I know for the viewers, I know we've used a few terms, but if you've seen my music episodes, I may have lightened the blow on some of this stuff, and I hope that I did kind of, accidentally prepare you for this tangent of the conversation here.
Yeah, no, you're right. This really is kind of a big deal, and we don't follow it up much. As I said, it was there was a whole group of composers and musicians who really became very concerned about it in the 20th century, mid-20th century. And a number of them tried to deal with it in really interesting and fascinating ways. I think it was Lamont Young, actually, who's a really amazing composer, who blamed all the ills of society on this fact that we're listening constantly to this slightly out of tune music all day long, right, and that's making us crazy. I think that might be a bit of a stretch, but it's an interesting idea. I couldn't disprove it. There does seem to be something about equal temperament. This is what's really weird. So we certainly think of just intonation. So that note that I was playing where it wasn't in tune with the piano, that is more natural. It's, as I said, it's a 5-to-2 ratio, just spot on, whereas the one on the piano is a close to 5-to-2, but an irrational number.
Right.
So in general, we think of just intonation as being more natural, but there does seem to be something weirdly organic about equal temperament. Yeah. People love it all over the world when they probably shouldn't. There are people, it's funny, you can actually even see, there's some interviews online where you can see people who've probably never heard Western music before and have only, most music in the world has been just tuned, so not tuned like the piano, not an equal temperament, just because, when you play it, it sounds better.
Sure.
And so there are people who maybe have never heard equal temperament before, but they like it as soon as they hear it. So that does seem like maybe there's something organic about 12-tone equal temperament.
That's interesting. It's often accompanied by a drum beat. So maybe that has something to do with
maybe.
it. On the tribal level,
maybe
the backbeat of 2/4 maybe is bringing, like, making it almost makes it like the way fast food is addicting, but it's really bad for you. Like maybe
That's true.
The backbeat is sort of. I don't know. Because it's
And
not always like that,
in Western music, compared to all other musics, we move pretty fast. So we kind of move chords around and change things pretty fast. Because if you really sit and listen for a long time, you can kind of start to hear how things aren't quite in tune.
Right.
But this is a complex issue. I've studied it, as I say, I started studying when I was 16. I'm still studying. I still have a teacher that I work with on understanding all this stuff. It gets pretty complex, but it's really fascinating. It's kind of amazing what we still don't seem to know about this. And it's kind of amazing that we often don't seem to be asking the right questions even about it, which is kind of interesting. But we'll see. It may get really interesting over the next few years as the information kind of spreads more about these things.
That's a good point.
But it is quite fascinating, this whole world of how things are tuned in their relationships to each other and what that means.
Right.
One of the bizarre things about all this is that, as I say, when I play this exactly in tune, that's 5-2 right there. We generally tend to like that more than this one. Let me make sure I got it right again. That's the one on the piano.
Right.
And here's the one that's perfect. 5-2. We actually kind of like things that aren't necessarily in tune. For instance, if I do this, so I'm changing the pitch of that upper note. You can hear it go ooh, ooh, down and up. We like that.
Right. Yeah.
We like if I do this, let me get this right. What I'm going to do is put an effect on here that makes everything kind of wishy-washy out of tune. We like that too. We like groups of people singing together.
Right.
And one of the reasons we like that is because it softens the intonation. So we like both. So there's this kind of curious thing about there is this real pure sense of just intonation, but there's also this sense of how does it matter? This kind of fits in with, I have a a little kind of axiom that I tell my students in music theory in general, that there are actual rules in music. They're based on psychoacoustic principles, and they're measurable, they're empirical. And if you follow those rules, people love it. And if you break those rules, people love it. It's really kind of how all this stuff works. So it's this really kind of curious thing of, they're rules, I guess, but it's just as effective to break the rule as it is to follow it. Both work. Right. And so it's really more about understanding these things and being able to use them in effective ways. That's really the trick.
Very well said.
And just intonation appears to be that kind of thing where, used in the right context, it just is magical. But, it doesn't have to be there. You can kind of get the point across without it. It just depends on the context.
Right, especially now that most people have grown up hearing it. Maybe not in Iran or, Russia, parts of Russia or something. But for the most part, like you said, some people haven't heard it ever, but a lot of people have.
Yeah.
And it's also a necessity. It's a cultural necessity that everyone in a village can perform this one very easy piece on that one day of the year that they do it. That it doesn't modulate and have all these crazy notes and fast, sixteenths and everything. It's not about that. It's about everyone being able to humbly perform the ritual together,
Absolutely. And I think you've hit on something really important there, that we do have this very particular perspective that we have inherited from the history of Western music. And it's amazing. It's extraordinary. Nobody else invented it, which is kind of bizarre. It's only in Europe that was invented. But it is a very particular perspective, and there's other ways to look at music and other ways you can make music that aren't built with this same particular set of parameters. It's all similar, but there's lots of other ways to think about music.
That is definitely true. And coming back to your own personal composing style, because you are actually composing for bass which is, it's not common. I know you know Jocko. So, he was a composer extraordinaire for, let's just call him a jazz composer to put like a broad, obvious term on it. But he also did have solo bass writing. And maybe not all the time, but when he did, you could tell that he had ideas that were pioneering and were going to go places. And I know you know your Jocko stuff, so that's for sure. And who doesn't learn their harmonics from Portrait of Tracy, right? I mean, you kind of have to. And if you don't, then you go there eventually, if your teacher takes you.
I actually didn't.
Really? What did it happen? It was like an accidental thing? How did it come up?
No, as I say, I was just really interested in... so we should probably explain what harmonics are. Everything that vibrates as a whole and vibrates in even number fractions in varying degrees. So if I play this string, you're kind of hearing it vibrate as a whole, but you're also hearing it vibrate as 2/2, 3/3, 4/4, 5/5, and so on. And I can isolate those fractional vibrations by putting my finger lightly on the string and kind of causing the string to vibrate more as the fractions than as a whole. So if I do this, here's the whole string vibrating, and here's the string vibrating at 4/4. And here's 5/5, 6/6, 7/7, and so on. So these are called harmonics, and they're really crucial. We use them as a technique in bass a lot, and was really most effectively used by this guy we're talking about, Jocko Pastorius, who I studied with when I lived in New York, and he was just amazing. But they're more than just a technique; they're the basis of all kinds of aspects of music. They're kind of a first principle in music, so you can explain a lot of why certain things happen in music because of.
Right.
Of these harmonics. Really fascinating and very involved. And so I learned about this just from studying music in general, and started kind of trying to work with harmonics a little and just kind of come to terms with what they represent, because it's pretty intense, actually.
Yeah.
And then I heard Jocko, who was just a master with them. As it turns out, bass is one of the really the best instruments to produce harmonics. French horn maybe is a little better, but bass is definitely one of the best. If you have a really high instrument, it's a little difficult because harmonics are always higher than the fundamental pitches. And so if you play a piccolo, you're hearing the harmonics, but they're so high that actually a lot of them are theoretically inaudible.
Right.
Whereas bass, you're kind of down more in this range where they really ring a lot. And so bass is a really good tool for kind of exploring harmonics and what they do. And so for me to have suddenly found myself as a bass player and somebody who is really interested in these concepts of just intonation and harmonic relationships and how they affect tone, not just harmony. This was a very fortuitous place to find myself. And so I spent a lot of my life kind of putting these ideas together and trying to build, at least in my own way, to try to keep going from what Jocko did, and also utilize these other ideas that come more from kind of academic music in the West and the East, come to think of it.
Well, I would say so. I know they worked on Kona Collins stuff too, and that we got to save that, because that's a whole different thing, and it's rhythm versus tala versus tala raga, right? So that's a whole other conversation, I think. So let me start here with this, because I think we didn't actually get into the topic I had in mind, which is great, because that's why somebody like you comes on this show, and that it changes people's lives to hear you speak about these things. It's really wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
And I think why don't we discuss what we initially wanted to discuss, because I think it's a big deal. It's a big deal for us as bass players, But it's an even bigger deal for the common listener of music who maybe doesn't even realize that they're listening to a machine, and why should it matter, right?
Yeah.
So I want to set the mood here with a quote from 1960 from the co-founder of Sony. And his name, I totally forgot his name, Masaru Ibuka. And February of 1960 now. So this is over 60 years ago, right? I want to set the tone for the AI-based discussion here. The word computer usually conjures up images of multiplication, division, addition, and analysis. But I think it's important to think of computers in a broader sense, as an artificial brain. Artificial brains will be very good at making inferences and recommendations based on accumulated data. So this right here, I think it already says why we shouldn't, I'm not saying we shouldn't have AI bass, but why we shouldn't replace a bass player with AI bass. It's because it really is it's just making inferences. It's just taking recommendations based on accumulated data. Bass players accumulated data. The data that we've worked our whole lives to be proficient at, to be experts at. And we don't use that term lightly. If you've been making bass lines for other people for, let's just put a simple number on 10 years or more, you now have an expertise that's worth somebody's, let's just call it, worth someone's time, worth someone's money even, because there are livings to be made. And if this is what you do, then there's a medium of exchange that should be required when you bring your decades of expertise to the table. And yeah, I can make a bass line in 2 minutes on a song that I've never heard before, but it's 25 years in 2 minutes. It doesn't just happen overnight. And what AI bass can be doing, it can be actually getting rid of that need in it to some people, because they want to, and I'm quoting it, I forgot exactly where I wrote it, but they want to quicken their workflow. Or as they say, unleash human imagination and creativity with AI. How are we unleashing imagination and creativity by pressing a button on a screen and then it does something for you? I don't know how they can possibly pass this off as, bettering yourself as a creative force, as an artist, or as a musician, or as a bass player. Does this bring anything to mind?
Yes, absolutely. The thing about technology is it always really kind of forces us, or at least encourages us, to ask big questions. So you can imagine when the first people made fire, they realized it was good for a lot of things and bad for other things. Right. You could burn down your whole environment if you weren't careful with it. And the steam engine, it made us way more productive, but also we got, horrible child labor issues and pollution and all kinds of things happen. And so here we are at kind of another branch point of technology. I think it's important to say, especially for non-musicians, that music is very, very algorithmic. One way to think about music is, so in language, we use 26 letters in English. In music, we just have 12 notes. We can talk about that as much as you like to, but really we kind of have these 12 notes. And kind of like the letters, you don't just combine them at random, right? Some combinations make more sense than others. So as you can kind of quickly imagine, with just 12 notes, there are a lot of possibilities, but it's not endless by any stretch. And some of the possibilities are much more kind of generally appealing than others. So this is low-hanging fruit for an intelligent system. In fact, it wouldn't really be very hard for an intelligent system to essentially write all the songs that could be written that haven't been written yet. It would be, probably millions, but not infinite, right? There's a limit to how much is there. So this really puts us in an interesting place where we kind of need to ask ourselves questions about what music is and how we want to how we want music to work. If machines make music that's better than any people ever made, then maybe that's what should happen. These are questions we have to ask.
Right.
Maybe no, maybe yes. So that's really my interest, is in getting people to think about how music functions in our lives. And, these, as I say, I would think that music is really easy to do. And I have to say, I'm a little bit disappointed by the interest in doing AI, especially AI music, visual art, and writing, because this is kind of solving a problem we don't have.
Yeah, great point.
People enjoy writing, people enjoy making visual art, and people enjoy playing music. People don't enjoy, I assume, cleaning up sewers and going up to clean up hazardous waste and 1,000 other jobs, or even driving. I know some people like driving, but we're not terribly good at it. It's really unsafe. So things like that I would hope that people involved in technology would work on solving something like that that's actually a problem. There's not really a problem with there not being enough bass players or people not wanting to play bass.
Right.
It may be convenient for somebody in the moment, but hopefully we can kind of start a conversation about how we want these things to move through our lives, because they're happening now, and it's happening quickly.
Right. And they are, as I say on the show very often, these are not old concepts.
Yeah.
Music has been written by computers before.
Yes.
And as early as 1997, I had researched something myself when I was in music college. And there's this idea of symbolic artificial intelligence, which means that it's a human readable thing. It's not just binary numbers, in other words.
Yeah.
And it was taking scores of Bach chorales.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, it's Bach with that little, at the back of the throat, but I'm not going to do that every time. And Bach chorales are very algorithmic, and you can definitely make a few up on the fly if you know how it works.
Absolutely.
For 4 voices very easily. So it was taking these and it was making its own.
Yeah.
And the person that did it, Steve Larson, is not the guy that created it, but he put a performance on. He put it's Experiments in Music Intelligence, EMI, is what this was called, this AI. And they called it AI back then, by the way, in 1997. He had that Bach chorale, a real Bach chorale, and they had a pianist play both of them, which added the human element, which might have been cheating a little bit. But the crowd agreed that the EMI, which was nicknamed Emmy, the Emmy Bach chorale is what they thought was the genuine Bach chorale. So he questioned what you're questioning, like, now what? Are we done?
Right.
Is music? Are we simply done doing this, right? But I have something to mention about that. Is that I held a little thing here because I had moved to Kentucky. I grew up on Long Island, New York, actually, for the first 40 years, and now I've been in Kentucky for almost exactly 1 year. And at the library here, I had this thing: music theory can change your life, no instrument required. And I set it up. I thought, let's see who shows up. I want to meet people. I want to get out there, And I had a few people. It wasn't that many, more than I expected. And the first thing I gave them is an image of the 3 pyramids at Giza. They're like, what's going on right now? I said, what do you see here? What is this? And none of them got what I was looking for. What I was looking for is that there's a bigger one, there's a slightly smaller one, and then there's a much smaller one. I'm saying, okay, this is the trinity of the family. This is dad and mom at their stereotypical height differences, and then we've got a baby here. And music has triads and other levels of 3s that you can actually relate to your own life or to things like the Pyramid of Giza, which are potentially very musical constructs. And that's, again, a whole nother conversation. So my point is this with the AI thing. Even if the AI is a better, and better as in pleasing to the ear, who knows? Dissonance is required. Dissonance is good, actually. It's not always, 2 notes that are right next to each other that sound ugly. Dissonance moves things. Without dissonance, we don't even have a need to, the song has nothing to do. So when we have a triad, we've got the root, we've got the third, and we've got the fifth. Let's just call it mind, body, and spirit, just for argument's sake, right? Normally, and some of the music that we've had lately, especially some of the ones that people think are some of the less interesting ones, punk, and music that uses chords that don't actually have the third of the chord. Now, 3 notes in a chord, they're taking out the middle one. Potentially the soul is missing, and we just have mind and body. When we have a computer system like AI, I feel the same way. The only thing it doesn't have is soul. Even if the music's better, it's not going to have human soul. And hopefully that's enough of a reason for people to hire you to play their bass line for them. Because it won't always be funky if it doesn't have to be. And even if you did study with Chaco, you're the funkiest son of a bitch ever, man. And by the way, your funk playing is awesome, but then you have albums like Equilibre, and it's an incredible soundscape. You use your EBO sometimes. So cool, man. So cool.
Thank you.
The only comfort that was taken away from the person who invented this EMI, David Cope, is that EMI doesn't generate style on its own. It depends on mimicking prior composers. So there's the other thing that I wanted to say in regard to this. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, maybe the AI is going to come up with something better now. With all the time in the world and all the computing power, maybe it can easily, right? But it's not going to be Jamerson playing a P bass. It's just not. Even if it's perfectly mimicked, it has to be wrong. When you listen to some of these bass tracks from the greats all by themselves, they don't necessarily sound in time, like a robotic time, right? But then in the track, it sounds perfect when you listen to a track. So hopefully these things can be at least noticed by even non-musicians. Hopefully they notice that the soul is missing. Because one thing that you also mentioned is the art. AI art has been a big boom lately, even though, again, it's not really new. I had an episode about that when that was booming about a year ago with a friend of mine who calls himself Symbolic Studies. He's incredible. And that's what came out of that too, is I was saying that maybe the silver lining is that people like me and you will actually be more valuable, because people can really tell when it's an AI photo, usually, right? There's something about it. It's missing the soul. And I really hope that keeps us above water in this, this cultural shift, musically speaking.
It's really going to be interesting to see what happens. I mean, we're going to have to ask, what does it mean to have soul? And especially in terms of music, how do we determine what soul is? And is it a quantifiable algorithmic process?
Right.
I mean,
wow.
We're going to find out, I guess, is what's going to happen. And again, I think the key thing is to ask these questions. I would say that the process hasn't unfolded in exactly the way I thought it would. I remember when computer music started getting popular. Originally, computer music was a very nerdy thing that people were doing, and then it became pop music. And I kind of didn't think we would see somebody on stage just kind of pressing a few buttons, and then music coming out that was rhythmically perfect, within the abilities of the computer, so down to microseconds.
Right.
And people just totally grooving on that. But, you can see these festivals all over the world, in Berlin, of people all grooving out to music that's just quantized as much as it can possibly be quantized. So, I'm sure those people feel their soul in that. As I say, the key thing is, we've got a lot of questions to ask here. I do think it's really important that we that we have an opportunity to think about what music is to us and how it functions in our life, because that exact issue has changed radically within just the last 100 years. And I think that's something that we're not often all that cognizant of, that might make a lot of sense to kind of go back and revisit that.
Yeah. Yeah, I would hope so. I really would.
Yeah. In the 20th century, there were kind of two new forms of music were invented. It's always dangerous to categorize things, but that's basically how our intelligence works. So we'll do the best we can. Music has always served a couple of basic functions. There's one way to look at it. It's not perfect. There's a lot of overlap, but there's kind of folk music that people made themselves to kind of decrease the drudgery of life or just express themselves. There was spiritual music, which every culture ever has had. Every culture we've ever known has had music, and they've always had spiritual music. And then there was this kind of aesthetic music, or classical music, basically. So a set of professional musicians who really studied their art and really tried to make a kind of highly aesthetic music. And that happened in Europe. It happened throughout Asia, in Japan, in Bali, and of course in India. Mostly involved with the court. People who were powerful would hire musicians to really develop the art so they could really have this aesthetic experience. In the 20th century, we got pop music, which I would argue is really a new phenomenon. A lot of people say pop music is a kind of folk music. With all these, there's a tremendous amount of overlap.
Sure.
But I would argue that pop music is different because folk music is really very regional. It's participatory. It's something that you make together, that people make. It's not something you just sit and listen to so much. It has nothing to do with fashion. In fact, it's often kind of anti-fashionable. It's something that connects you with the past, and it doesn't have anything to do with making money. And pop music, we speak of it being successful if it makes money, regardless of the content of the music. If something makes a lot of money, that's successful. So that's a new thing in music. That didn't really exist. Again, this is very generally speaking.
Yeah.
We also got this kind of people who had been involved in kind of this, what I'm calling aesthetic music. Classical music, I guess, works too, although that term is very complicated. They kind of moved into this place of academic music, where they got this idea of making music, and they really didn't care if anybody liked it. They just wanted to make really great music, and if people didn't like it, often that was good because it meant it was more advanced than the people could understand.
Right.
And this kind of caused a bifurcation in music. Now, the academic part of it really kind of has failed. It was very successful in the academy and in universities and stuff for a long time. But nowadays, even that, there's still people who do it, but it's such a small number of people just playing for each other and writing for each other. But pop music has kind of eaten everything else.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. We don't really even have spiritual music so much anymore, which is really kind of bizarre because for the entire history of music, and we now think that goes back 60,000 years because we think even the Neanderthals were making music, which is really kind of amazing. So that's kind of, is this major aspect of music, this spiritual nature of it. And even kind of if you go to church nowadays, you kind of hear more something that's, a little bit more watered down, more poppy, where that pop sensibility has kind of taken over everything. Now, pop music is not bad. It's amazing. It's extraordinary. It's incredible. But it is something we could think about, whether, we really want to exchange these other ways of experiencing music for this kind of way of experiencing music in this pop context. So I'm sorry for the long digression.
It's great.
But I think that's an issue that would be nice to see people just thinking about more and discussing more.
It would be nice, and it would almost get rid of this whole conversation too. We wouldn't have to even be discussing this.
We might.
I think a lot of times most, and this is generalization, but a lot of people they almost, if it's not starting within 5 seconds, if it's just someone singing, it's just not good enough. They skip it and move on.
Right.
They don't even have time for that music, they say, Are you familiar with this book from David Reck, The Music of the Whole Earth? You familiar with this?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I
oh,
haven't
man.
seen that one in a long time.
There's a lot going on in there to speak to the tribal aspects of what goes on in a village, what goes on in spiritually, and even ways to possibly notate it which is really, it's just a crazy errand indeed. Because it's the Western system is not necessarily adequate for lots of different things.
It is. It's good for notating Western music, and a lot of music is built around the notation system, actually, which is something that happens. But there's other ways to think about it.
There it is. There's the symbolic AI. It can take that, and now, of course, it can make that. That's easy.
Right. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing about this is it's all pretty easy to do. I have no expertise at all in computer science or anything, but these are not complex systems overall.
No.
There are things that are complex about them, and as you study music more, you can kind of see these more complex avenues of it. But overall, these kinds of things are simple. I think listeners might be aware that there have been a number of lawsuits lately over somebody plagiarizing another piece of music and getting in legal trouble for that.
Right.
There are only really a few patterns we use, especially in popular music. And so that's going to become more and more difficult, and they're reused over and over. I can think of a number of artists who I've never heard try to come up with their own or even a slightly unique, for instance, a harmonic pattern, a pattern of chords. They'll just use ones that are very common.
Sure.
And you can do that in music. And if, you can still call it your own, even though you're using a harmonic pattern that's been used hundreds of thousands of times before.
You can't copyright those.
You can't copyright them. That's right.
If you write on guitar, I guess that would be pretty restricting to not be able to use GDC because I get that.
And there are reasons other than just the mechanics of the instruments that we use those patterns. Some patterns really have very specific, very powerful emotional resonances, and others less so. And if you study music enough, you can kind of understand how that is. But music is kind of almost shockingly limited in some ways. And so it's, as I say, it's a low-hanging fruit for these automated systems.
Right.
So we're going to have to think about how we want this to happen in the future and in the present, in fact.
Right. Wow. Some part of it might be, and maybe it's off course, maybe it's not, but there may be an issue with the way that you end up having to monetize yourself as a musician. Maybe people are soullessly not charging enough, where they're like, I can't keep this up because they're not making enough money doing it, but they're working enough. They should be getting enough out of the amount of work they're putting in. Maybe there's a monetization issue. Maybe people like us can charge a little more for what we do because it's so special. Like, listen to the conversation we just had, folks. We really are, I don't want to use the word, but we have expertise. I'm not going to say we're experts, okay? You're an expert. But we have expertise that goes far beyond any calculations that can be made by a computer. And it's, again, it is simple. It isn't something a computer can't do. But to pre-program a computer to be able to have this conversation right now would be, what's the point of that? Why are we even here in that case? Humans in general. We're here for a reason. And being able to make music, there has to be something more. Perhaps we have actually oversimplified it. Perhaps we have like a reductionist, an accidentally reductionist mentality about what music can and should be for us. And the idea of the spiritual music missing is potentially a link to that idea. It could be very easily brought back if people did take the time, if people did want to experience music as opposed to, and here's one of those things that bother me so much. Certain styles of music really keep people away, even if it's classical or like really extreme metal or something. But when it's in a movie that they're watching, it's totally fine and they're absolutely accepting of it. So what is so maybe there's a way to give it to people. I don't know what it would be. But the whole point of this is that in 2020, they tried making a bass program. Now Sony's officially making a bass program. It can match the timbre, which is the tone of the musician by, you have to give a reference, of course.
Yeah.
But once you produce the reference, it can produce an entire song. But what's different about what's happening this time is it's not a set number of bars. It could be arbitrary what the track is. But it does require the input of a track. Mm-hmm. And then it creates a bass line to the track, much like somebody like me and you would do if we were hired.
Yeah.
So that's what's new about this one. And I guess that, it's getting better at doing the learning. It's getting better at adjusting and maybe playing a certain way, a certain swing, a certain style. But, it's not that far off from what's already been done.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how far this is going to go, but they're labeling it now that now they're pointing the finger at us. They're
Right.
an AI bass player now. Well, the AI bassist isn't going to do your solo work. That's for sure.
Well, we'll see.
Well,
We'll see
okay,
where
you're
all
right,
this
you're right.
goes. Some of the experts say that AI, isn't quite as impressive as it seems. Some experts say that biotech is really where the huge innovations may happen, and I know people are squeamish about that, but we'll see where that goes too. So one way to think about this is we've all seen AI, Chat GPT and things like that. So we've seen these things that AI writes, and we've seen the hallucinations it has.
Right.
So it's writing something that sounds perfectly reasonable, but it's just complete jive, complete made up stuff.
It's just floating around, yep.
So it kind of indicates some of the weaknesses in these systems. While they can seem very impressive, they can have really powerful weaknesses. I was really shocked when I first learned about these Chat GPT hallucinations, because it just seemed to me, not having the right information that's a deal breaker for me. If the thing is spitting out jive, then it's almost worthless as far as I'm concerned. And it seems like it'd be trivial to have it just reference, better information, so it didn't do these things. But in any case, so we can assume, I think, that the AI generated music will be similar to that it could make something that sounds really impressive, but a lot of it may be just complete jive.
Yeah.
And it may not be kind of like the written language. It may not be really detectable on first listen. It may have to be something that you kind of dig under the hood a little bit and find out, oh no, this is really just nonsense. This is not really, it sounds impressive, but it's just nonsense. It's a little tricky talking about music that way, because as I say, if you have a musical experience, then as far as I'm concerned, that's certainly valid and probably good music.
Agreed.
But this is something that we might look out for in AI music. I don't know. We'll see. This is all happening now around us.
Right. That's why this is great that we're having this talk, because this all happened, you posted something on Facebook about this exact Sony AI article. And I immediately said, oh man, I would really love to chat with you about this. And, and you humbly agreed. We're not standing here telling you that, 440 is going to kill you and equal temperament is going to melt your bones, and that this AI thing is going to, destroy the entire realm that we live in. It's not like that. But I want to ask you one more question that might keep people, and my listeners aren't necessarily going to be like, oh my God, what is this thing? I can't believe this is real. I'm horrified. They know what's going on, right?
Yeah.
But just to further empower ourselves as working musicians, right? What keeps you learning? What drives you to keep going? You've taken it pretty damn far, as far as I can tell. So what is left to keep you learning? What pushes it? No wrong answers, by the way. No wrong answers.
Thank you. I'm just passionate about this, about music in general, and I have to say, I've spent my whole life just learning as much as I could about music and being just as immersed in music as I can be, doing all kinds of different projects and from different perspectives. And it has been interesting that the more I've learned, the deeper it's gotten, and the more central that the whole concept of music has become. Now, there may be some bias here, obviously, but it does seem to me that music is really perhaps the most central aspect of being human. Language is usually given that position, but I don't know. I would argue that while language is certainly important, and all cultures have had language, all cultures have had music as well. And what's interesting about that, this may not sound right, but I can back it up if you like. We all have the same music. If you listen to music from another culture, it may sound really weird and out there, but its similarity, the similarity of music around the world is way more intriguing than the differences. And there does seem to be something, kind of an overall message in music that's out there kind of waiting for us to discover. And this is, we can talk more specifically about this if you like, because, as I say, I have arguments to back all this up. This is something just enormously central, where there's some kind of thing happening in music, and it's really the most mysterious thing I know of. It's way more mysterious than UFOs or Bigfoot or whatever you got. Music is this, it really is magic that's right here under our noses. I could say this, that it does seem that no other species has this music we have. And I know that's going to sound iffy, because birds do amazing things and whales do amazing things. I would argue that that's a little closer to communications, a little closer to language than it is specifically to music, because they don't use the patterns that all people use all over the world.
Right.
And again, if you hear a bird song and you have a musical experience, then that's music. That's fine.
Sure.
But I'm speaking here about something a little different. And in all my study, I've never found a really good explanation for how this is happening in just humans. It's almost like we've been implanted with this little message we're supposed to decode that's complex, but it is kind of singular. It really is extraordinary. It's kind of hard to understand it, because you kind of have to come at music from a whole lot of different angles before you see that. But it does seem to me that music has this extraordinary place in what it means to be human. And so the more I've gotten into it, the more of kind of an obligation or responsibility I've felt to try to do better and try to understand more and to experience more and to try to communicate better. So I guess it's that. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it really does.
I'll be glad to go more into detail about any of those things. Some of it gets a little technical, but...
No, and I do have the thumbnail up, but I'm going to change the title of this to What It Means to Be Human. I think that should be the name of this episode, because that explains, and your answer there is, that's my point. I wanted to get more of that out, where another reason why AI bass or AI music, it can't. There's no way. Even if it mimics it perfectly, it doesn't matter. It's a machine.
Yeah.
It's just zeros and ones,
Yeah.
So why don't I think we've generally come full circle on this, and I'm just thrilled about everywhere we went with this, But I'm going to leave us and the viewers with this final question here, because it's been like this for a bit now. And now it's getting worse with specifically, again, AI bass. Why are people so hell-bent on making money with music, but absolutely refusing to pay any musicians to do it for them?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And it probably bears saying, although I hate to sound like this, but the music business really has gotten a lot more challenging for. There used to be a pretty large middle class of musicians, and that's pretty much wiped out at this point. There are people being very clever and figuring out how to make it work. So, this is one of those things. This is not 100% kind of statement, but it is something that bears thinking about with all this other stuff together. I would love to have people have more thoughts and conversations about how, what music is, how it functions in our lives, what value it has to us, how we should think about musicians, all these questions, and whether, if a machine is creating music, if that's, how we feel about that and how that's going to work in the future.
Right.
Yeah.
Is it what we want? And, on the other side of it, do people want to pay a movie ticket price for AI movie? I feel like people wouldn't, or do you want to pay for robot sports? Would you prefer to pay for robot sports?
Yeah. Yeah.
So hopefully, because people don't put music in this category sometimes, it's very strange.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, if you allowed, robots to play in the NFL,
Right.
it would make the games really strange, right?
Yeah.
Because your robot could just run over everybody and
Right.
nobody could get the ball out of its hands. Its quote hands.
Right. It would just
right.
Exactly,
So it would make a weird kind of game, and that's kind of we're already kind of edging well into that territory.
Sure.
Music. Yeah.
But there might be the final issue here. I was mentioning dissonance before being a requirement.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just say fumbling and dropping the ball is the dissonance, right? Now we've removed the dissonance from the sport. Now what?
Yeah. Right,
now
right.
every single time the pass is thrown, it's going to be a touchdown, I guess. I don't know. It's
right.
We're losing something.
That's right. It's something that I hope people will think about, and again, I'm biased, but I think music is important.
Yeah.
And I think I would like to help start conversations about how music functions in our lives and how we want it to function, because it can do amazing things. The music can accomplish extraordinary things.
It's true. And even knowing how theory works at a base level, no instrument required, like I said earlier, that can actually help you maybe think about your own situations in your own life, your own dissonances.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's required.
Absolutely.
You need to resolve it. You resolve dissonance. You move forward. You find the tonic again, and then you're at peace. You're at the point of rest, right?
Absolutely. The music and the human experience, they're kind of inseparable. So,
well, I hope that gives everyone listening and anyone you want to share it with a very good reason to not do the AI music route and keep making sure people like you are never going to stop making music. Thank you for everything you've done over the decades. I mean, you've given us so much musically. And
that's very kind. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And, what and hopefully now people can even have a better idea. Like, that's where it's coming from. It's not that you're just some lucky break overnight practicing in the dark and like you found something, and you're working from scratch and you're tirelessly working. And that's why you're the musician that you are with the respect that you have. Thank you.
The pleasure's mine. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. All right. Well, everybody, you know what to do. Share this with anyone you think would love it, especially if they've never seen my show before. And this one will definitely not be exclusive. I want everyone to see this, but, get my exclusives, Rockfin Patreon, and check out my website, check out my merch store, check out my new book, all that stuff. Thank you so much, everyone. And I hope you loved it. And Michael, thank you again. What a pleasure. What an honor.
The pleasure's been mine. Thank you.
All right, guys. We'll see you next time.